Russian President Vladimir Putin says there will be a temporary ceasefire in the war in Ukraine next week. He wants it to coincide with the anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. Ukraine has responded, saying, make the ceasefire immediate. It comes after President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met at the Vatican over the weekend. You see them there on the screen before the funeral for Pope Francis. It was their first face-to-face since that Oval Office clash back in February. After that meeting, Trump, who has repeatedly said he believes Putin wants peace, took to social media to criticize Russia's targeting of Ukrainian civilians. Trump questioned whether Putin was serious about stopping the war or was just, quote, tapping him along. Trump also addressed the situation after getting home from Europe.
I was very disappointed that missiles were flying by Russia, but that missiles were flying. I want them to stop shooting, sit down and sign a deal.
As for that deal, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on Meet the Press that this week could prove pivotal.
I think this is going to be a very critical week. This week is going to be a really important week in which we have to make a determination about whether this is an endeavor that we want to continue to be involved in, or if it's time to sort of focus on some other issues that are equally, if not more important in some cases. But we want to see it happen. There are reasons to be optimistic, but there are reasons to be realistic, of course, as well. We're close, but we're not close enough.
NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez has more for us from London. Raf?
Hey there, yeah, Vladimir Putin declaring a 3-day ceasefire in the war in Ukraine next week to run from May 8th to May 11th. The official reason is commemorating the anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and it is the second time in just a couple of weeks that the Russian president has unilaterally declared a ceasefire in Ukraine. But it is very notable that this announcement from the Kremlin coming shortly after Donald Trump stepped up criticism of Putin, saying he was disappointed that the Russian leader continues to bombard Ukrainian cities and is questioning whether the Russians are negotiating in good faith to truly try to end this war. The president talking about potentially imposing new sanctions on Russia to force them back to the negotiating table. Now, this all came following a pretty dramatic meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky of Ukraine at the Vatican over the weekends. They were both in Rome for the funeral of Pope Francis, the two leaders sitting knee to knee, just one-on-one, the first time that they have met in person since that disastrous encounter in the Oval Office back in February. Now, President Trump emerging from that meeting, stronger criticism of Russia. That will be very welcome to the Ukrainians, but there are still major gaps here between the different negotiating positions, and slightly less welcome in Kyiv. President Trump saying that he believes the Ukrainians are ready to recognize Russian control and sovereignty over Crimea. That is something that the Ukrainians have said is an absolute non-starter. We are hearing today from the Russian foreign minister. He is laying out a set of demands for ending the war that sound pretty similar to the demands that Putin announced in February 2022 when he launched the full-scale invasion. He's talking about what they call the denazification of Ukraine, recognition of Russian sovereignty over eastern Ukraine, and a commitment that Ukraine will not join NATO. So this is a very difficult path ahead for these negotiations, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying this is going to be a critical week in determining whether these talks have any path forward. I'll send it back to you.
Thanks to Raf for that. And joining me now is New York Times diplomatic correspondent Michael Crowley. Michael, the Kremlin says Russia's ceasefire pitch for next week shows their goodwill. But is there any indication Russia or Ukraine are ready to make a deal, especially when you see the optics of what happened before the Pope's funeral? President Trump and President Zelensky sitting face to face, knee to knee, actually looking for the first time, frankly, like allies. Does that change the Russian calculus at all?
I don't see it changing Russia's calculus. You know, I think Vladimir Putin feels like he has a clear upper hand here. You know, the United States, the American support has kept Ukraine in this fight, has allowed Ukraine to survive for the last few years. And Donald Trump has made clear that he thinks that that support should either end entirely or be pared dramatically down. And I just think that Vladimir Putin feels like time is on his side, given that reality, and that if he's going to make a deal now, it should give him close to everything he wants, because if there's no deal, he can carry on the war with the expectation of dramatically reduced American support and realize his gains on the battlefield. So the big question here is, with Donald Trump kind of facing the first real test he's had of his friendship with Vladimir Putin, the first sort of butting of heads they've had, is he willing to actually impose any kind of a penalty on Putin, or will he just sort of say, I'm walking away from this whole thing, and also walk away from Ukraine and allow Russia to essentially run roughshod over Ukraine in the absence of any deal?
Well, and you talk about the fact that Putin is benefiting from the time that he has right now. Frankly, Trump has been giving him much of that leeway to play with. And it especially is apparent on issues like Crimea, because you listen to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, over the weekend, and the way he talks about that issue. And it's perhaps a win because it's off the table in the negotiations. Listen.
President Trump said Crimea is not even being discussed right now.
Yes, because this is a done deal.
You mean Russia occupies and controls and will not negotiate the future of Crimea? Is that what you're saying?
Russia do not negotiate its own territory.
Now, we got to remember here, as I know you do, that Crimea was illegally annexed by Russia in 2014. The Ukrainians have said that they are not going to give this territory back. And yet you see President Trump even just taking it off the table. So this is a clear sticking point, even as we try to ramp things up this week to get some kind of a deal.
Right. And Ukraine is just never going to accept this. Ukraine has the same position, the one that is validated by international law, which is that it is their sovereign territory and it was seized by the Russians. What's dramatic about this is that from the time when it was first seized in 2014 by Russia and the Obama administration, and including in Trump's first administration, U.S. policy was that America would never recognize Russian control over Crimea, that it was sovereign Ukrainian territory. In fact, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Trump's first term issued something called the Crimea Declaration, saying that the U.S. would never recognize Crimea nor change that policy until it, as Russian, nor change that policy until it was back in Ukrainian hands. And Donald Trump, just in one fell swoop, has walked away from that and made a concession with no clear exchange of concessions from the Russian side.
Michael, where do your sources think that this will go if we get to the end of this week and it's still clear that a ceasefire is not tangibly on the table?
I hear a lot of pessimism. Given Trump's track record, all the evidence suggests that he is not going to pick a fight with Vladimir Putin. He does not like to challenge or cross Putin. He likes to make him happy. And he has a long history of disparaging Ukraine, of fighting with Vladimir Zelensky. And all that prologue would suggest to you that rather than somehow escalate pressure on Russia using sanctions that he has vaguely threatened to do, that what he'll do is remove support from Ukraine and turn his attention elsewhere. And as I said earlier, that in effect gives Russia an enormous upper hand in this conflict. And Russia, you could expect to make dramatic military gains in the coming months. And then, at some point, does Ukraine cry uncle, or is Ukraine potentially even defeated? And we'll have to see what that looks like.
Yeah, it's especially important as we consider the ways that the American political landscape has changed in terms of the appetite, or rather lack thereof, that exists on the Hill to continue providing military support and financial aid to Ukraine in this fight. Michael Crowley, thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you.